Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Paxtle Wash Process Mexico from Say Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And they're a coffee roaster that needs no introduction, as they are one of our most featured coffee roasters on this channel. In the past, I have said that we've tried to limit the amount of coffees that we do review from Say. However, circumstances did force our hand with this coffee as we were running low on coffees to review. So I did go to a local coffee shop to see what they were offering, and this is the only coffee that they had. However, it does work out given that I have wanted to review more Mexican coffees, and it's been a very long time since we last reviewed one of Say's Mexican coffees. In addition to that, you guys definitely do enjoy our Say reviews, so it'll still be interesting to see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, there has been a lot of discussions about Say's profile, as they have definitely gone through some changes over the last couple of years, and this one right here I don't necessarily think was ever meant to be the lightest coffee out there, given that it is a Mexican coffee, and I feel like there's only so light that you can roast a Mexican coffee. That being said, by comparison to a lot of its contemporaries, this one still is on the lighter side of things. I have seen Say generally get a little lighter over the last couple of months. Even then, not going to be an ultralight or overly light coffee, or even on par with some of the older coffees that we've reviewed from Say in the past. So by that standard, I would say probably somewhere on the lighter side of a medium light. Yeah, that's probably the best way to align this one. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was surprisingly nicer than expected, as it definitely had plenty of the traditional characteristics to it, with an abundance of the listed chocolate, as it's definitely a central, I guess it would technically be North American coffee, but it definitely offers a lot of those characteristics, the chocolatiness, the caramel, the nuttiness. But what was really interesting and what stood out about this coffee was the fruit intensity of it, as it definitely did have a fair bit of the listed berry qualities, leading to a better than expected first impression. And when I picked up this coffee, as mentioned, it was mostly out of desperation as opposed to actual desire to pick up this coffee. I was really hoping that it would at least have some, I want to say, cleanliness to it. It wouldn't necessarily be an overly boring coffee, but having it be as fruit forward as it was on that first impression definitely did take me by surprise, so I was quite pleasantly pleased with the way that it turned out. Day 19 through the Chemex, and there was a similar sentiment this time around, as it is surprisingly sweeter and more intense than expected, especially for a Mexican coffee, as there's a nice bit of a sweeter spice to it. I can kind of see a little bit of a cinnamon quality in that regard. Plenty of the listed chocolate and honey, as well as there's a little less fruit intensity, but overall nice cleanliness, and I will probably continue to highlight and focus the cleanliness of this coffee, because I do remember a long time ago when I first started drinking Mexican coffees, how they always just seemed to not taste particularly clean, and it's really nice to see just how much Mexican coffees have evolved over the years. This one was just very clean. Day 22 through the UFO Brewer, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it's offering plenty of the traditional qualities with a lovely bit of sweetness in a listed honey sense. High level of sweetness once again, and I'm going to continue to go back to the sweetness because Mexican coffees historically for me have not necessarily been the sweetest. They haven't been the sweetest, they haven't been the most fruit forward, they haven't been the most intense, but this one continues to offer that with excellent balance and plenty of that chocolate base once again. So it was pretty nice all around. I probably should have read up a little bit more as to why Say even purchased or picked out this coffee, because Say usually has a pretty good reason for why they grab the coffees that they do, but I was just pleasantly pleased with the way that this Mexican coffee was turning out. Day 24 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, 17:1 at 99 Celsius. So we did push it, and this was vindication, or I guess I should say, it wasn't really ideal for this coffee specifically, as it was the least impressive it had been to this point. It didn't yield too drastic of a difference off brew, as it was definitely pretty chocolate forward. However, it lost a fair bit of its structure as it did cool down, so that wasn't necessarily ideal. Less balance, less definition. So on day 26, we tried the same thing through the Chemex, and the coffee just didn't turn out well when we pushed it, as it seemed to accentuate more of the traditional Mexican qualities to it, as opposed to what was an earlier honey and fruit forward experience. So it's a good day nonetheless, but I definitely felt like we needed to adjust this one. Day 29 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15-1 and 93 degrees Celsius, and it was one of the better days of this coffee, so I definitely didn't feel that pushing this one was what was best for it, as it went back to being pretty clean and well-defined with some great structure to the chocolate base, and a slight bit of tartness that's in line with the listed strawberry. I can see it being in a slightly unripened sense in the way that it did present in the coffee, especially on this day. Day 31 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is still solid with the lower extraction adjustments, but I definitely had a strong preference towards the V60 with this coffee overall, as this one just seemed a fair bit more tame. This was a bit more in line with what I would expect for a wash processed Mexican coffee. I think berry qualities to it, but nothing too exciting. So on day 34, we went back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and this confirmed that this was by far our preferred brew method. And there is definitely a sweet spot with this coffee. Obviously, there's a sweet spot for every single coffee, but it was just so obvious with this coffee that pushing it too high did take this coffee to a slightly unstructured sense, and keeping it too low did make this coffee a little bit too tame. So it was just so distinct, as usually there's not that much of a difference when you adjust a coffee, but this one definitely had significantly better structure, significantly better intensity and definition to all of the qualities in it when we kept it at a more moderate level of extraction. So really enjoyed the final experience this one, as I felt like it's probably one of the better experiences I've had from a Mexican coffee. Granted, for as many coffees as we drink, it's very rare that I actually have many Mexican coffees. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. It's interesting to me that we put the spice at a level 1, but I guess I completely missed the sweet spice on that. Let's go through it though. We'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. Very clean. As mentioned, growing up drinking these Mexican coffees, I didn't necessarily get a lot of definition to them. I'm trying to think of what a contemporary is when it comes to coffees. Maybe a lot of the way that Chinese coffees taste these days is they aren't necessarily the cleanest or most intense at times, even the wash processed coffees, but the more we continue to have Mexican coffees over the years, the better I'm finding them to be. So the cleanliness being there at the level 4, especially given the structure and balance to this one, is actually very enjoyable for what this coffee is. If anything, I could say that it's on par with a lot of the Guatemalan coffees, Colombian coffees in that regard, as those tend to have the same characteristics to them and are also very clean, but this one right here just did a very good job of mirroring that in a lot of ways. Finish, level 4. Really enjoyed the finish of this one, even if it was a little bit more traditional. So you'll see that nothing is necessarily overly high in this tasting wheel, but the finish being a little bit more of that honeyed sense to it, a lingering sugary quality to it, but definitely very enjoyable for this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. In the same way I discussed the cleanliness not necessarily being the highest when I first started drinking Mexican coffees, that's the same thing for the sweetnesses. More often than not, I found them to be a little bit tame, a little bit lacking, but this one right here is very nice, and again, on par with what you would hope for and expect for your average everyday washed Guatemalan coffees, which, I mean, those have a very high ceiling, so this one did have a pretty moderate ceiling to what it was. All right, let's go ahead and move on to level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. I don't think this coffee was ever going to score higher than that. And truth be told, it might be one of the less bright coffees we've had in a bit, but I think that's largely a component of what this coffee was, never really intended to be the most bright. Florality level 3. Even with that honey quality to it, presenting in a slightly floral sense, I don't think that there's too much really to add to the floral characteristics of this coffee, as it is a little bit toned down in that regard, but again, nothing in this coffee was ever intended to be particularly intense. Berry fruit level 3, and they had that strawberry note listed on there, and I'll be completely honest, I've had so many Mexican coffees in the past that I've had a lot of fruit notes to them, and I said, okay, maybe if I really think about it, maybe if I prime myself, then I can see a faint trace of these fruit characteristics, but this one had the best, most defined berry fruit that I've experienced from a Mexican coffee that I can recall, so credit to them on that. They earned that level 3, and I could be really generous and bump it all the way up to the level 4, but given what we usually score at a level 4, that's a little bit of a stretch. Citrus fruit level 3. I can see some slight apple-like qualities to it, some slight citric brightness to it. Again, it's not anything overly intense, so level 3 is where we opted to keep that. It's still a little bit more moderate and toned down overall. Chocolate level 3, there is plenty of the chocolate though, and that's not really surprising that it scored as high as it is. That's been an ever-present with Mexican coffees for as long as I can remember, washed Mexican coffee specifically. Caramel level 3, there is a really nice kind of toffee-like quality to it. A great bit of sweetness. The honey makes a lot of sense too, given there's a lot of that sugary sweetness. And then just one final thing worth discussing, and that is the body at a level 3. It still has plenty of body and texture to it, so that's probably what you would expect from a coffee like this. But yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what we were getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I'm glad I was forced to buy this coffee, largely because it did give me an opportunity to review a Mexican coffee, and one that I turned out to enjoy a lot more than I was probably expecting. This is probably one of the better Mexican coffees that I think I've ever had, probably one of the better ones that we've ever reviewed on this channel. Again, I don't have too many, we don't review too many, and it's a little bit of a shame when a coffee like this turned out as well as it did, because it does show that Mexican coffee does continue to improve over the years. And looking back on the same Mexican review that we had a very, very long time ago, it's such an interesting contrast to see how much more this coffee was enjoyable than compared to that one. So credits to the producers especially, as I do think Mexico does continue to improve their coffees, and I'm very curious to see where they might go from here, and we'll definitely try to review more in the future. Just really hope that a lot more notable coffee roasters do carry more interesting Mexican coffees that are more than just chocolate and nuts. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you're curious about Mexican coffees, I think that this one's a very good one to go to, as I have seen a lot of coffee shops, multi-roasters that do carry Say still offering this coffee, as I don't think it was the most popular coffee that they were offering. Again, the reason I was able to pick this coffee up was because the coffee shop had so many of these coffees still available, so it could definitely be worth a shot. The berry qualities are a little bit more pronounced than you might expect for a Mexican coffee. Very clean, very sweet, and just pretty well rounded, pretty well balanced. A lot of what you'd expect for the more traditional characteristics of a coffee, with a nice fruit quality as well. I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Paxtle Wash Processed Mexico from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.